Welcome back to the Logistics Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Karl Siebrecht. It's great to be with everyone again. Today, we are going to talk about venture capital and the supply chain, more specifically, how venture capitalists have been investing in and helping to drive innovation in supply chains. With me today, my guest is Will O'Donnell, who is the managing director of Prologis Ventures. Will, it's great to have you.
Great to be here, Karl.
Let's just start very basically. If you'll just tell us kind of who you are and what you do.
Certainly. So, well, Anna, as you said, I've been at Prologis for over 20 years so far. Get background on Prologis. We're the largest global owner of logistics real estate. So we own over 1.2 billion square feet of warehouses in 20 different countries. Throughout my career here, I've served a pretty wide variety of roles, but the last 8 has been focused on really starting and growing our corporate venture group. And Flex was actually our first investment 8 years ago. But really looking, and I'll get more into strategy, but how do we leverage our platform and areas of focus to really expand and grow? So we as a company own the logistics real estate, but so much in logistics happens inside the warehouse, outside the warehouse, and you have all these interconnected parties that are trying to work to move goods. So we've been really focused on helping build out that ecosystem and strategy, both with investing in companies like Flex, but then also incubating and starting. And then we do a lot of partnerships with more established companies, or spend a lot of time co-innovating with our customers to really understand where pain points may occur.
That's great. That's great. So, can you characterize or summarize your Prologis Ventures investment thesis? You kind of covered it in the intro, but how would you sort of frame that?
We look at it from a standpoint of where do we have an opportunity to drive change. So, in a couple key areas, so one, we own a bunch of buildings, so we do investments around real estate and prop tech, but with a focus on industrial.
Right.
Construction is another big area of interest. We build a couple $1 billion of new real estate a year. So, understanding how we can help drive more efficient construction processes, but also looking at net zero. So new
Mm.
concretes, green steel. So how do we help our business meet our net zero requirements and actually find more sustainable materials? Where we spend a lot of time is around supply chain and logistics.
Mm.
And for that, the general thesis that I've had and developed over the years is everyone in the industry made a lot of money by all these different services becoming unbundled. By that, we own warehouses, so we're really optimizing on rent. Someone else operates the warehouse. They optimize on operating the warehouse. Someone else owns the trucks. Someone else owns the ships.
Right.
When we look at the modern day supply chain, all these different pieces need to come together. And customer level expectations, whether it's same day, next day, have just increased, putting more pressure on a supply chain. The complexity of manufacturing, that people are sourcing materials. And it's created a unique environment where, although you have all these partners who have optimized for individual components, to get the supply chain to work, you need them to work in tandem.
Mm.
And you need to have connectivity between all these different pieces. So what we've done is really sat there and realized, okay, we have a perspective from the owner of infrastructure, but how do we sit with our customers, understand where their common pain points are? How do we sit with other providers, understand their common pain points, and then co-develop solutions?
Mm.
So the thesis has really been around supply chain is incredibly complex process. So how do we get most VCs focus on software for a reason that it's scalable. So once you have the R&D costs up
Right.
front, you put the software in a cloud and through SaaS you can simulate it anywhere, and it's like a net
Yeah.
zero incremental cost. Supply chain is actually the opposite, where we have to move physical goods. So you're suddenly starting with the concept of I've got to move atoms from one place to another. How do I apply technology on top of that? How do I digitize it? So it creates a unique, I think, situation where you're trying to apply technology to existing processes, and you have to have both a very deep understanding of how the system works and connects together, but also realize what constraints can be removed because technology can be introduced.
Mhm.
So just because we did business the same way for the last 20 years doesn't mean it has to continue to operate the same way. And if you think about constraints, a lot of them are self-imposed. So McDonald's most successful day they've ever had was the day that they decided that they were going to serve breakfast after 11 a.m.
Is
And
that
there's
right?
a whole lot of questions like, okay, how do we redo our supply chain? But that was a self-imposed constraint that McDonald's had put on themselves. And our business, the same way, is we've moved goods through this process over the years, and people used Excel spreadsheets to communicate, et cetera, right?
Right.
But now, as technology has become more effective, how do we relook at the process and think how we can do it differently? And even, I mean, if you look at your business, it really took technology and spun how do you think about inventory storage in a much more flexible manner?
Right.
And that 15, 20 years ago, the technology wasn't there to be able to remove that constraint and give people the ability to have a fixed supply chain and a flexible supply chain. So that's a lot of how we think about it is how do we connect these different pieces, understand why the system has been in place how it is, what constraints that will exist moving forward, but what constraints could technology or change in business process actually address. And
Fantastic.
then
Yeah.
the third area we spend a lot of time around is energy.
Okay.
And by that, we are the second largest operator of rooftop solar in the world, and about 4% of our roofs are covered. So there's a
Wow.
huge opportunity to build a massive distributed energy company. And we're able to help our customers achieve net zero goals by being able to produce renewable energy at or below the cost of what energy traditionally. So we've spent a lot of time building out that business and looking at technologies. EV charging infrastructure is another area that our customers are going through a transition. The infrastructure is in place. We happen to own a lot of the facilities and know how to buy real estate, know how to work with utilities, know how to put in infrastructure. So we've brought in a team who really understands transportation in the EV market. And then we're starting to do data centers, so power generation and technology around where we are today with the grid versus looking ahead in the next 10 years where our national grid needs to get to.
Mhm.
What type of technology needs to be invested in to really drive power generation and more efficiencies in power consumption?
It's fantastic. Okay, that's great. Lots to unpack. I want to reference a McKinsey report that just came out July of 2024, and it is titled "Logistics Startup Funding: The Investor Pullback Continues," and then the subtitle is "In the Post-COVID-19 Era, Investors Pinch Their Pennies." Those pithy titles from our friends at McKinsey. And you get into the meat of it, it shows the data that says investment dollars have plunged 90% over the past 2 years from the peak year in 2021. So clearly, I think to anybody listening and anyone certainly who's working in the sector, some of the buildup was COVID related, call it COVID tailwinds. Maybe some of the fall off is a correction or a COVID headwind. But what do you think? Like, does this say anything about venture capital as kind of not being a great fit for the category? Because to kind of borrow one of your phrases, this is more about atoms than electrons, and it's a little bit far afield from a classic venture investor's mindset.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a starting point, you could probably take that title and apply it to any industry, and you're going to see a pullback.
Hmm.
So I could replace supply chain with fintech. I could replace supply chain with like
Fair, yeah,
the only one that hasn't had a pullback is AI.
yeah,
Um, so I think yes, there's been a pullback, but then there's been a pullback from investing in startups overall. So you just look at venture capital dollars deployed when money was free, lots of money was flowing out. When there's a higher expectation on returns, venture capital investments have slowed
yep,
considerably. I think specifically within supply chain, a couple things happened. During COVID, there was a lot of almost expectation so 5 years of e-commerce transition got pulled forward into 6 months.
Hmm.
And the reality is, once the world opened up again, people actually do like going into stores. The experience there. So I think, yes, you've seen an accelerated adoption, but to some degree, it resorted back to the mean of the curve.
Okay.
So we accelerated 5 years, but I mean, people like to go in the stores and experience and touch clothing. So you look at a lot more retailers, they've moved to a more experiential engagement, both online, but then offline has become more and more important because that's what consumers have resorted. So I think there's an element that if you looked at the curve of adoption and just continued in that same trajectory, there were expectations that it was going to continue in perpetuity. But in the reality is, yes, you accelerated, but it went back to the
Okay.
acceleration
Yep.
that was probably more traditional before. I think, secondly, out of that, there are a lot of business models that people made assumptions that would be quickly adopted. And I'll do an example of the 15-minute grocery delivery.
Hmm.
That is an incredibly hard business, both on the margins for grocery traditional, but then how do you build out a supply chain that can have the right inventory at the right time within 15 minutes of my house that gets density to delivery?
Right.
So the unit economics there are really, really, really tough to make work. And there was just an incredible amount of money that went in to fund these capital intensive businesses under the assumption of we'll buy scale and at scale all these economics will work. Instead, it turned into we're going to subsidize consumers buying for try to capture market share. Where I'm going with this, I think that was an incredibly hard and capital intensive model that unfortunately a lot of people got burned on, and then the capital disappeared from continue to invest in it. And it was such an inordinate amount of the spend that if you actually separate that out,
Mm.
true supply chain, yes, there's been a decline, but it hasn't been 90% down. Um, I think the third thing is what we touched on earlier. It is a hard sector to invest
Yeah.
in. That said, 2.4 trillion was spent in the U.S. last year in supply chain. So it's, I don't know, roughly 8-9% of GDP.
Incredible.
Companies have actually recognized that it is now a mission critical part of their business. Like if I don't have the right inventory in the store shelf at the right time, I lose consumers because now there is a plethora of options. So I think in a way, it's become much more paramount of companies to actually figure this
Yeah.
out. So companies are spending more time to try to figure out how to invest into it, but capital's gotten more expensive. Freight itself, the transportation industry has been in probably the worst recession in at least 20 years, if not
Okay.
ever, for the last two
Yeah.
years, which has put a lot of pressure. And by the way, cost of capital for all of us got more
Yeah.
expensive. So you're starting to see decision-making timeframes shift out. But at the end of the day, I think the mission critical nature of supply chain has actually increased. So companies are trying to figure out how to invest in it, how to make themselves more resilient. They're just doing it in a more thoughtful way. And some of the business models that may not have had the best unit economics that people got burned and are pulling the money out of it. So the fast forward, I think it will continue because it is such a vital and critical part of driving commerce. But you now have a people who are a lot deeper understanding of both the intricacies of supply chain, but then also how to apply new technologies against it to create opportunities. So maybe I'm a little biased, but I'm actually optimistic that it's going to continue to accelerate. I think the amount of dollars that were flowing in were pretty
Yeah.
unsustainable. But I think we could point at a lot of other industries too that are stuffing a little bit of the same withdrawal from capital because capital was going into places that didn't give the right
Yeah.
returns.
So got it. So there was arguably a little bit of irrational exuberance, particularly in some subsectors of logistics, super fast delivery, in particular grocery, but that doesn't mean that the broader category lacks opportunity or that venture capital as a particular type of capital is a bad fit for the sector.
Yeah, and I think on that, there's going to be different categories of capital that come in because a lot of supply chain is infrastructure
Right.
related. So I think you're going to see more of the infrastructure funds take a look at some aspects of it that tend to have a longer hold period
Yep.
and rates of return that are more commensurate with an infrastructure investment. There's definitely going to be software and data investments, and you're going to see venture capitalists focus on those areas because they may align more with their return expectation margin and the risk profile.
Yeah.
So I think even within supply chain, categorizing the different opportunities and what's a true technology, what's a business model that's now tech enabled, and what's an
Right.
infrastructure, to really simplify it, it's a little more complex than that. But if I just put in those three categories, there's opportunities for different buckets of capital to come into each. They just need to understand the return profile. So if a venture investor is investing in something that is really an infrastructure play, then you're going to have a mismatch. At the same point, infrastructure investors aren't really looking at the growth, et cetera, the profile that's needed for a traditional software company that may be trying to attack supply
Right.
chain.
Right. Okay, so Will, you've talked about a couple of things that are related. One is that it was actually a great perspective that over time, uh, the value chain of supply chains has split apart. So there are a lot of different companies that are tackling individual segments of the value chain. I mean, obviously, Prologis is the world's largest owner of warehouses, and there are other companies that focus on freight, the freight service. Then there's the assets in freight. Then there's a brokerage and a technology layer of freight. So it's broken apart. Um, that's one dynamic that is true. Two, the second dynamic and related is that all those things have to work really, really well together for that ultimate customer here, the shipper, if you want to call the B2B customer, the shipper, in service of the consumer. And maybe the third dynamic is that in technology, has to be, is already, but certainly has to be a big part of that equation for sort of tying together all those disparate players in service of the ultimate goal, which is to move stuff from point of origin to point of destination, at the lowest cost per unit, on time, right? So that's kind of the industry that we're playing in, which I think, given the reality of that, having the perspective of operators at the forefront of what investments, what innovations, what technologies are the most promising is really important. It's people who bring an operational mindset. They understand the complexities of of moving the atoms around. Is that a fair way to think about it?
It is, and I think okay, AI has been a huge topic of
Yep.
conversation recently, and putting aside foundational models, which there's a select few spending a lot of money on creating new foundational models. The question everyone's trying to figure out is, well, how do I apply AI to my
Right.
own business? And this is where I get most excited for supply chain as a whole because, as you just described it, there's all these siloed parties that traditionally have operated in their own silo with their own data. But to get the visibility that's needed, how do you create more connectivity across these different parties, but then able to process data in a really efficient manner that can drive actionable
Mhm.
insights? And I think that's the core of what AI can do is it can it is an industry like how do we get more cooperation and overlap between all these different parties in a way people are interested in contributing their data in because the output is greater for everyone than the data being proprietary is for one
Right.
individual
Right.
player, right? So, and just an example, what I'm talking about there, like all of us were willing to carry phones in our pocket that told people where we were because that now means I can share my location data with Uber and a car can come
Mhm.
pick me up, right? And the cab drivers are willing to share their information because it gives them
Yep.
access to a market. So that's where am I willing to forego my privacy to let people know where I am right now? I am because the value of me contributing that in
Yep.
is much greater. And to translate that to a B2B standpoint, we've all used data proprietarily in the past to drive our own business decisions, but by a Prologis or a trucking company or an operator contributing portions of their data into a greater visibility tool, does that open up more
Right.
opportunities? And I think that's a one of the biggest challenges of the industry, but also where the
Yeah.
biggest opportunity is. And as a human going through just reams and reams of data, trying to figure out how to extract that insights, not going
Yeah.
to happen. But if AI can help us do that in a more efficient manner and then translate it to actionable insights, you're enhancing people's ability to make
Yeah.
strategic decisions. And that's where I get most excited about moving forward. It's how do we create the coalition of the willing, I guess, but how do you get people together in a room looking and say, okay, here, like efficiencies of transportation and the amount of deadheading that goes with trucks, like how do we get different people in a room who might have different
Yep.
components of that data that can share it in a way that suddenly opens up opportunities?
Have you seen a shift either amongst the shippers of the industry or the logistics service providers in the industry? Have you seen a shift in their kind of willingness to share or their risk profile around sharing information and taking more bets on innovation?
Yeah, I have, and I mean, as I said, Flex was our first investment 8 years ago, and if even at that time there was only a select few companies that were actually embarking on how to even provide new technology
Right.
and services to supply chain. And I think with the journey that you all went through, well, the first couple of years, a lot of it was education on teaching people like there is a way to think differently and just like we can continue to do what you have been doing, but here's something that can augment it
Right.
and make it better. I think if we now look who we are 8 years later, people, it's less of why we need technology to drive business decisions and why should we change to okay, we know we need to. Now the conversation seemed to be more on
Hmm.
like how, and there is still a willingness to a much bigger willingness now to try new things and work in collaboration and co-innovate. I think the challenge with like supply chain as a whole, it's kind of like the offensive line in football, where like it got prominence during COVID because it suddenly broke and suddenly
Right.
C-level executives were paying
Right.
attention to supply chain, right? Like normally it just operates and that's kind of good. It's like the well-run
Yeah.
offensive line just blocks and tackles and the
Yeah.
running back scores. So there is an element of we need to figure out a way to work in collaboration that doesn't put the greater supply
Yeah.
chain at risk, but can drive incremental changes. And that's where I think a lot of companies are going through and understanding like how do we streamline our process of testing? How do we get data faster? How do we collaborate in a way that doesn't cause
Yeah.
operational harm, but can actually accelerate the adoption? And that's where I've seen the last couple of years a lot more companies reaching out and sharing information and trying to figure out
Yeah.
best practices.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
yeah.
that's well put. One of the things I find myself saying probably more frequently than I need to is that it feels like in the journey that we've been on, um, the mentality, broadly speaking, of the industry has shifted from playing defense to now starting to play a little bit more offense, just to use another football metaphor. But supply chains, it's a in the people, many of the people who have been very successful over the decades, it's kind of this: hey, don't lose stuff, don't break stuff. Send me a couple points, save me a couple points of margin next year, and like you get the gold star. Um, but over the past several years, and certainly I think COVID helped to accelerate this view is that there's an opportunity here to drive innovation through supply chain that can really create competitive advantage. Now, there's risks to doing that because it's kind of like back to your offensive line. If something goes wrong, your quarterback could get smashed and he's out for the year. But it's how to thread that needle a bit. But we do see more and more companies being willing to test and try and experiment more.
Do you think also part of it's due that during COVID, everything happened so fast that you didn't have a chance to, okay, we're going to run a year pilot. It's like, okay, in the next 3 weeks, then you need to get this done.
I
And
think
they
that's
did it, and
exactly
people
right.
are like, oh my God, like the world didn't fall apart. Like this actually works. And like,
I think that's exactly right. It's exactly right. I mean, the cost of inaction was far higher than the cost of potential failure in trying something new, and I think that was a lesson learned from a lot of people. And look, I think that it also put the spotlight on the supply chain, in the boardroom, and a lot more focus around agility, resilience. We hear these words a lot. I just recently there's an organization, research organization, it's fantastic, called 0100. We've actually had them on as a guest before, and they have some research that they've been doing, and it kind of falls under the umbrella of resilience on offense. I may not be getting the phrase right, but that's the essence of it. It's how to take what we learned in frankly, building and investing in resilience as a reaction to COVID and other sort of natural disasters and international conflict, and shift that into, now how can we do this more proactively. So I've gotten a peek at it. It's super cool, and I'm excited to hear more from them. But I think that does strike on a key shift that's happening in the market.
yeah, I think I really like your point on the cost of inaction. And I hadn't really thought about it before in those terms, but it did expose, and I think people took for granted, like, okay, a certain percentage of our sales every year are going to be diminished because of stockouts.
Right.
And it was just kind of like an assumption that was underwritten that people just dealt with. And there was now during COVID and everything with the pressure of the supply chain, I think people realized that, wait a minute, we can actually address that. The technology
Mhm.
and systems have changed to allow us. So I think that's actually one of the bigger motivating factors that we're seeing is that people can realize that they can proactively drive their supply chain now
Right.
and be ahead of. I mean, it's one of those that supply chain and just on demand was one of those things that looked great on PowerPoint. And everyone came out and we redid all our supply chain to meet just in demand. But then you have a black swan event that happens literally every year, whether it's a pandemic,
Right.
whether it's hurricanes, it's floods, there's now wars, right? And you don't underwrite those black swan events and you kind of write it off as a once in 100 years, but if every year, a once in 100 occasion. So I think people realize that they were viewing supply chain as a reactive endeavor, but by investing in technology, they can actually get ahead of it.
Right.
And there's a cost of inaction of not dealing with it. But by proactive, it actually gives them a competitive advantage because they'll have the right inventory in the right place where their competitors may not.
That's right. That's right.
I really like that cost of inaction.
One of the ways I've thought about this a lot over the years is, when the marketing organization inside of enterprise companies started to digitize, going from television ads and radio ads that weren't really very measurable to basically internet-based ads that were very measurable. The first thing was like, oh gosh, we can measure all this stuff and we can do ROI, and that's super important. But then we shifted or evolved further into constantly running tests, constantly running tests. You're testing ad copy, you're testing color, you're testing placement, you're testing, keywords and search constantly, right? And so the mentality shifted to, you're always running experiments. In fact, if you're not running experiments, you're not doing your job and you're going to get fired, right? So if I'm the CMO, part of my agenda is, what experiments are we running right now? What are we learning? A bunch of stuff isn't working. That point will come, I believe, and should come, needs to come in supply chains, right? We should always be running an experiment, not like, oh, we've got the machine, it's well oiled, we don't want to mess with it. And oh, maybe one off we'll do, hey, we're going to plan a one experiment for like next Q3. You know, think about when there's constantly a test plan and we're constantly testing things. Like, that's the way this needs to work. There's a lot of plumbing that has to happen to get there. But frankly, a lot of those capabilities are available to people today. And the bigger blocker to that being true is, again, kind of a mindset and a risk aversion perspective.
A weird coincidence for the audience. Both Carl and I were in digital advertising in the late 1990s and the early
So you know
2000s.
what I'm
So
saying?
I know exactly what you're saying. But yeah, you're right in that, like, I think the advancement of technology to allow quick tests, because it's really hard to run tests on a physical nature where you're like, okay, I'm moving goods. How do I test two paths against
Yeah,
each other? And people used to say, okay, it's going to take me 6 to 9 months to plan it out. And I think you're right. People have figured out, like, how do I continually test? How do I capture that data? And then how do I communicate across an organization? Because if only one group figured it out, okay, it's incrementally better. But if we can
right,
share it with a much broader audience, then it actually becomes effective.
right, right.
And if
And
you're in a business that, as you said earlier, that saved me a couple basis points here and there, like, if you can accelerate that savings, it compounds really, really quickly.
absolutely. And, look, I think for broadly speaking, a lot of the tech infrastructure, the companies that have like their core technology has evolved now over the years, probably not as fast as any of them would have wanted it. But to be able to pull out, a specific product line or a specific region or a specific channel or a specific whatever and run, a well planned test, I just think it unlocks a tremendous amount of value. So give us a sense of either what's in the portfolio today or stuff that you've had a peek at. What are kind of just some of the coolest technologies that you've come across? Coolest, you can define that how you would like, but
Yeah.
just yeah.
I I think if we break it into like some broad trends, I mean, one of them to start with is just sustainability. And
Mhm.
I think for me, what's been most exciting about the advancement in technology there is twofold. Is one, there is really a true ROI now, and that business decisions can be made around sustainability because they're better business decisions than the prior. So,
Mhm.
example, I was talking to someone who's a large public infrastructure in Texas, and by buying wind energy, they're saving 20% a year on their energy cost.
Wow.
Now, it's great they're buying wind energy, but it's even better for that business in Texas that they're saving 20%
20%.
because
No,
of their
yeah.
source of the energy, right?
Yep. Yep.
So as a starting point, that now that these are actually really good economic decisions, it drives adoption faster. And I think the industry as a whole has realized that subsidies are in place to help get scale. But
Mhm.
why is the adoption happen really, really? It's because at the end of the day, you can sit and tell your shareholders that we're driving value through the economic decisions. Now, personal level, like if I can go through and help an start an EV charging infrastructure that can like influence the outcome of conversions of trucks on a massive scale, like I just made the world a better place for my two daughters.
Yeah.
So on a personal level and motivation of the employees, like to be able to do what we're doing on the renewables and EV charging infrastructure, and then looking at green concrete and green steel, like we have the ability to influence an outcome that I get excited about and feel fantastic because I'm going to make the world a better place for my kids and the next generation.
Yeah.
So that's an area that we are spending a lot of time. I think, secondly, within supply chain and logistics, that as companies have gotten more adept as everything we were just talking about, how to test technology, how to use technology, and how to adopt and think differently. We talked a little bit earlier on data, and that for me is one of the more exciting places to go. And it's data for the sake of data is kind of useless because you end up with all these big data lakes that no one knows what to do with.
Right.
But it's then how to take that data and drive actionable insights and enhance decision making that I find fascinating. And I think one of the values in AI in our business is, I don't know, I'm gonna make up numbers, but directionally, like let's say someone spends 70 to 80% of their time trying to find information and then spends the 20, 30% of the time thinking strategically
Mhm.
about what to do with that. What happened if we can inverse that? And now they're only spending 20 to 30% of their time trying to collect the information, and now they can focus on the 70% driving true strategic decisions on it and be more predictive. And that just has some fundamental shifts on how the supply chain can operate. And we as consumers, like if we can get access to better medicines on time, if you can get the right goods at a cheaper price at your house, like it just opens up so many opportunities on driving commerce in a way that's beneficial.
Right.
Um, and I mean, obviously, inflation's a big topic these days. How does a more efficient supply chain that is 2.4 trillion a year, if we can drive more efficiencies through that spend, it does bring down inflationary cost.
Yeah.
Now that is a much more complicated, but to overly simplify it, I mean, that's part of the value of technology and something that's an underlying infrastructure that you
Yeah.
can drive efficiencies that weren't there that ultimately will accrue to consumers or accrue to the companies operating or accrue to everyone across that supply chain. So that's an area, and within that, you get technology, and robots are always really cool to look at and see how they go, and I think the autonomous vehicles, the drones, like there's a lot of just cool technology. Computer vision is
Yeah.
fantastic on like how do you capture insights and drive value, whether it's through safety, whether it's operational efficiencies. How do you eliminate fraud in our industry?
Yeah.
These are just some societal challenges that I think technology can help us address in a more efficient, better manner.
Yeah. I love the way you characterize that. So the 2.4 trillion of spend per year, it's a huge lever, right? It's a huge lever. If you can get some results against that lever, it could really have an impact broadly across the economy, right? It's that big. 9% of GDP.
I think it's like 35% of trucks driving on the road at any time are deadheading, which means that they're empty
Right.
because they're driving from one location to another. So let's say about half of the supply chain spend, well, it was 850 billion was trucking last year, and about okay, 35% of those trips are trucks
Oh,
driving
wow.
around without cargo. There's no one that's accruing to that's a benefit because the truck drivers would prefer to actually be carrying stuff because that's how they
Yeah.
get paid. The company the shippers would prefer to have fuller trucks because their prices are
Yep.
going to go down, right? So it's this problem that usually when there's inefficiencies, there's somebody who's benefiting who fights it. In this case, things like that, there's no
Right.
one who's benefiting from it. It's just a systematic problem of like how do we better share information across the various stakeholders in a way that allows for better transactions. So that's where I get excited that I think a lot in supply chain as technology comes in is we can attack these universal problems and just rip out cost to the benefit of every single
Yeah.
provider.
Great. Okay, so let's get your thought on a prediction. So 3 years from now in logistics, what do you think will be one of the biggest, most highest impact changes?
I think a continuation of what people are doing on inventory management and inventory placement. You guys spend a lot of
Mhm.
time working with customers, but the better predictive customers can have about having the right inventory at the right place at the right time that then
Yeah.
leads to density of delivery, the products being available and consumer wants it, is a
Yep.
really hard problem to solve, but the benefits to everyone are massive, and that's part of what the whole premise of Flex is trying to do.
It is.
Um,
Yep.
it's not an easy problem though, as you're well aware, which for me, as an owner of logistics real estate, as Prologis is, like it's a really important thing that we can help solve for our customers, but we need other parties around the table who control different parts, all working in
Right.
tandem. Um,
Right.
so I think that gets solved through data analytics to allow it to happen. It can get solved through automation that once you have a repeatable process, then you can start putting automation to even drive faster throughput and
Yep.
enhancing the human productivity. I think it gets into how do people visualize the supply chain? How do people get much more predictive around where I'm bringing inventory and when? Um,
Mhm.
Without getting into politics, there's obviously a lot of issues or challenges are happening in global logistics, how do we think about what's coming, the challenges that may happen? How do we get resilience and get sourcing from multiple different locations, et cetera? These are
Right.
all things that by providing better information across the, I guess, the entire system, people are going to be empowered to do that, and that's one of the biggest changes that I see in the next 3 years. Is it's going to be a collection of different technologies coming together, but it's going to allow people to get much more predictive. What you said earlier, be offensive on defense, and I think that
Yeah.
change is going to be one of the ones that drives a lot of the investment there. And then the sustainability around it, that's obviously an issue. So how do we do it? If you're doing it in a more efficient manner, you're going to have less unnecessary trips, unnecessary waste, etc.
Yep.
And then an area we haven't really touched on, but it's going to be important, is the recycling aspect of this and circular economy.
Okay.
So the amount, I mean, there's a lot of studies published on like amount of re-commerce where people buy 5 versions of the same dress to test it on and they send 4 back. Like being
Yep.
able to better manage and process that inventory, make decisions as benefits to everyone, from the retailer and being able to limit the cost of returns to the consumer to be able to give them a better experience. And then for society, that we're not throwing a bunch of unnecessary plastics and waste and et cetera in landfills, right? So I think
Right.
there's things like that, and just figuring out how we can make them for more efficient supply chain system, they get really exciting. And just what we talked about earlier, the shift from why are we doing this to how do we do it, how do we test, I think it's going to accelerate adoption in the next 3 years.
Okay. Two more. You spoke about AI before, but would love to just hear your view on where do you see the most immediate impact of AI across the supply chain?
So, like most companies, Prologis has been testing pretty heavily how do we integrate AI into our own
Hmm.
workflows, et cetera. And where I see the most immediate impact is and the take it to a higher level. I mean, we as a company have been really focused on data centricity the last 4 or 5 years. So how do we clean up our data? How do we get it in the right working order? And it was hard, like the change
Yeah.
management, actually getting to it to the point. 2 years ago, 35% of the entire company's bonus was tied to us hitting data centricity metrics.
Wow.
So when everyone suddenly realized that our pay was going to be done and they sent weekly reports out, well, lo and behold, like we hit 99% data accuracy in the areas we
Yeah.
wanted. The timing could not have been more fortunate, because in November of that year is when OpenAI came out and released, here's our thing. So suddenly
Right.
we had a very clean data lake. Um, and for me, the most powerful thing is we had for years been telling people, like, put the data in, your life's going to get better. People didn't really recognize it until
Yeah.
suddenly we started releasing Prologis GPT, where before, if I wanted to know how many food and beverage companies in Texas we had in our different warehouses, their rank and number of square footage, that would be a multiple day process of me talking to data scientists.
Yeah.
Now I literally can go into our Prologis GPT, and while I'm on the phone with someone, I actually have that answer. Um, our
Amazing.
HR handbook we've digitized, so now I don't have to call an HR specialist and ask them who our healthcare benefits are. I can go in and type it in GPT.
Yeah.
Um, so it's where I've gotten the most excited. Me to see the immediate benefit is we invested the time to clean up our data, and now we can actually access in a way that I can immediately have information, and I can be super curious and ask questions that I never thought of asking before because of the time that it would have taken to
Right.
ask those questions.
Right.
And that for me is one of the more powerful things, and it opens up curiosity, because now people are less concerned about, oh, I'm going to go have to ask our data science team and put a bunch of work on them, to,
Yep.
wow, like here's 5 other things I could be asking. So it's empowered our people to be very intellectually curious,
Yep.
which is ultimately lead to better solutions, because we're now thinking more on the outcomes we can drive versus what the process to get the information would be.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Such a good overview. That's actually one of the best um, characterizations of internal adoption that I've heard. Not that I'm interviewing people on this every day, but that's great. And it is so true. It's like the hard work, and it's no fun, is getting all the data in order. Um, Tie it to everybody's bonus. That's the takeaway from this episode. uh,
Little controversial was done, but I think it was one of the better decisions that we made on our data
yeah,
journey because we would not be here today if we hadn't.
sure feels that way. Okay, so one last question for you. So out there in your travels in the field, what is one of the craziest things you've seen out there in a warehouse or in the field?
Well, I'll answer craziest that are actually practical.
Okay, this could be like a
I've seen a lot
bloopers
of
video
crazy
too.
stuff, but it's like, whoa. I think the more like getting warehouses that have more and more automation and be able to break down. So, like when pallets come in, being able to break them down into individual components and restack into cases that are actually relevant to customers and rebuild pallets. But the amount of systems, what's interesting about that is there's basic business processes that happen in a warehouse, whether unloading and loading trucks, palletizing or
Yep.
depalletizing, so breaking down a pallet, put away or storage, which is literally putting in rackets in racks. Like each of those are individual processes, but to get automation to happen, you need all of them to work interchangeably, and you might have multiple different solutions doing components of it. So it's this like incredibly fantastically hard puzzle
Yeah.
that it's not static, it's always changing. And so how do you build an automated system that allows that to happen? Because manufacturing and agree is easier because you have a limited amount of SKUs and a repeatable process. So I better build the Ford Escort the exact same way every single
Right.
time, and there's only going to be a limited number of SKUs. But in logistics, there's an unlimited number of SKUs, and there's an unlimited number of variations of packages that are going to go out the door.
Yeah.
So the mental map of like, how do I solve that and pull like the software together, the hardware, like the different business processes, when you take a step back and actually see it working, it's really, really cool.
Yeah.
Now, I'm clearly a big robotic nerd, so like my daughters look at me like I'm crazy when I sit there and explain to like my 14-year-olds why I think robots are cool, but they'll grow up and understand the dad and what they're talking about.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, we have a thing where if we're driving through warehouse country anywhere, the eye rolls start from my daughters before I ever start saying things. We play the guess how many square feet that building is, and I have a
Yeah,
great time with that. Not so much with my three daughters.
my both my kids play soccer and lacrosse, and the state cup games for soccer are always out in Central California. So we have to drive through
Right.
Tracy, California, which Prologis owns a
Oh
massive
yeah.
park, and we're seeing. So my tours of our warehouses explain like this is how the car we're driving in was actually paid for. A lot of eye rolls,
Yeah.
but
That's fantastic. Well, Will, this has been really great, super informative, and really fun as well. Thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast.
no, this has been great, Carl.
We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you again soon.